Good morning. Well, you know, it goes both ways. I'm so thrilled that you all are here. When Pam called me and she said, you know, I've been working in Los Angeles and I want to pull together for Human Rights Watch this group of educators, and they're coming from all these different organizations, I just jumped. Because what an opportunity for all of you and for me to see this happening. So really, it's very mutual. I'm thrilled that you're all here and that I'm here with you. So, so good morning. I'm actually not going to speak about what I've been doing at all because that's not important. But what I'm going to be sharing with you today, I think, is I'm going to try to give you a bit of an international context for human rights education, to give you some inspiration, I hope, for what others have been doing outside of the United States in regards to human rights education, where some of these impulses are coming from, some promising approaches that we've found around HRE which might be interesting for you to know about and might actually be somewhat informative as we think kind of collectively about how to promote human rights education in LA. Typically, we're looking at our own classrooms, or we're looking at our own organizations, or we're in our own offices. We have a very we're all very busy, and we're very focused on what we do. And human rights education, in order to be successful in schools, is of course ultimately about what happens in classrooms, but it's also about what happens in schools overall. It's what happens in teacher training colleges. It's more than just what any of us individually do. So the potential to really do something systematic and collaborative in LA, it's not only exciting because it can happen, but because it needs to happen in order for there to be a real, genuine, deep engagement and understanding of human rights with our young people in LA. So this is really important. I would like to begin first by talking a little bit about how human rights education has been spreading. I will say, and I date myself here, that when I first started to do human rights education, it was in Central and Eastern Europe. It was the post-totalitarian countries there. It was '92, and it was a very, very different time in the evolution of human rights education. And I swear I would never have imagined ever in 100 years I'd be here in the United States speaking to you all, because it was so underdeveloped even then in Europe, which is where there's a lot happening. We had, at that time, we had like the ABCs of teaching human rights that the Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights had done, that's been reissued since then. In New Zealand, someone named Ralph Petman had pulled together a human rights curriculum for primary schools. I could hardly find anything to help me work with ministries of education in those countries to infuse human rights education. We sort of had to make it up, which actually was fine. But since then, we have so much more that we can draw upon in terms of resources and experiences. So it's really thrilling. And part of the reason why these things have been happening is that we have, for example, UN agencies that have really been promoting human rights education, and it's logical. Obviously, HRE is about ultimately understanding and promoting knowledge about the international human rights standards. And those of you who teach HRE know this is very familiar to you. I mean, part of the agenda is that the public, our students, know that there's international laws, our countries sign and ratify them, we harmonize national laws, they submit reports to treaty bodies, there's accountability by the state and by others who are watching to see that human rights are implemented as states have committed to do so. Human rights education is really fundamental for the UN system and international human rights standards to work. It seems so obvious, but it's worth saying anyway. UN agencies themselves, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, UNESCO, UNICEF, regional human rights bodies, they themselves over the last 15 years have increasingly emphasized the role of education and training in promoting human rights standards. This is new. But there's a whole body of information now coming out about the right to human rights education. So this probably doesn't affect your own work, but it's just to say that the policymakers themselves, the very institutions that are developing these evolving standards, have themselves realized how important this is. And not just public awareness, but in schools in particular. There's now something called the World Program for Human Rights Education. Has anyone heard of that? The World Program? Okay, well, there was a decade for human rights education, and it went from 1995 to, I think, 2004, and it was mildly successful. It was not overwhelmingly successful. So the UN General Assembly passed the World Program for Human Rights Education subsequently, which is a permanent world program, which means we're never off the hook to do human rights education and training. And the first phase is focusing on schools. So in conjunction with the World Program for Human Rights Education, the UN is pushing member states through the assemblies to try to promote human rights education in schools. And sometimes we have national plans of action for human rights education. It's happening in some countries, or national plans of action for human rights, which has an education and training component. So there's a movement coming internationally from some of these international agencies, which doesn't touch our lives a whole lot, but can filter through to typically not ministries of education, but departments of state or foreign ministries. Lots of times the higher level interests for human rights education are actually from our foreign policy departments, just for your information. So, but why is human rights education growing? I mean, I've really thought about this because I'm still struck by it. And I think one of the explanations is the evolution of the human rights movement itself. I mean, the fact that Human Rights Watch, for example, is here and has been working and doing human rights education in school says a lot about human rights groups recognizing the role of education and training. And typically it's NGOs or nonprofits inside of countries that are taking the opportunities formally given by things like the World Program for Human Rights Education and trying to push things. So Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, educational organizations like Facing History and Ourselves that has a social justice orientation are increasingly taking in human rights as a normative framework, which is thrilling. And so I think one of the explanations for HRE growing is the evolution of the movement and more into the public domain, but education and training is a piece of that. I also think that globalization it's kind of a catchword we hear a lot. But there are people that spend time thinking about it, not just on the streets protesting around it. And globalization is happening also in education. So there are people like at Stanford and other places, I'm sure here, who are looking at the ways in which educational systems are designed, learner-based outcomes or curricular standards, how those get passed from country to country. How is it that so many educational systems are looking more similar in terms of their curricular approaches? I mean, they're not homogeneous, but there's more and more similarities. And human rights education is one element of or norms related to human rights have become increasingly recognized as a part of global citizenship approach. I mean, the closer we all get, to each other, at least in terms of ICTs and communication, the more harmoniously our educational systems are relating to one another, the more we're looking for a common framework. So, human rights is about standards on the one hand, and the treaties and the laws, and these are things we need to help our young people understand better. But there's also norms, or human rights principles, like equality, non-discrimination, inclusiveness, and so forth. When those kinds of normative frameworks become the standards which we can use for commonly across countries. So more and more, and I'll get into this a little bit later, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but we need days. But more and more, the idea of citizenship is it's local and global. In fact, in the United Kingdom, they have local and global citizenship standards now. And global citizenship standards have human rights norms as the framework. Another explanation for why HRE is showing up more and more in schools internationally. Another explanation is that in the human rights world, the right to education has gotten a lot of attention. And typically, right to education has been focusing on access to education, like in countries where there aren't enough schools in rural areas and so forth. But more and more, that's shifted into a rights-based approach to education, meaning that schools themselves as a whole, as an organism, should reflect human rights principles. And that's not just curriculum in the classroom, it's the way that schools run. It's the degree to which students have opportunities for genuine participation. So the human rights language is also moving into the whole domain of schools. And I didn't give you the statistics, but I wanted to tell you that in terms of the growth of HRE, between 1980 and 1995, of course these stats are what you can get your hands on, but the number of organizations devoted to human rights education quadrupled. I mean, it's incredible what's happened. And there's many, many, many countries that now have HRE in their curricular standards. Now, the degree to which they're actually taught and how they're taught is another discussion, but it's really showing up more and more. And even here in the States, I think it's Dennis Banks that did a study. I think there are the majority of states in the United States have curricular standards that link in some way to human rights. Whether it's optional, whether it's a subject that's integrated within civics or history, that's another matter. But technically, they're opportunities. It's not It's not an umbrella, but it's there. So in ways that maybe it wasn't there 15 years ago is my point. So the human rights-based approach to schooling is another a kind of avenue into schools that are related to human rights themes, and I'll get into that when I get later into this presentation on different approaches for HRE in schools. I think it's worth just sort of sharing with you why I think it's important, because we're all here and we're to some degree believers. Otherwise, we wouldn't have come out on a Saturday morning to UCLA. But I think that it is really important, not just from sort of the premise that unless people know about their human rights, they're not going to be able to sort of promote them, and that's probably significant enough. But in principle, our young people in schools have a right not only to a good education, but I think we owe it to them to prepare them to be real global citizens. And in order to do so, it's I think knowledge about human rights and conditions for human rights in other countries and in our own is a sort of a premise for that. And accountability is a really important part of human rights as well. As you know, if any of you are teaching standards, I understand that you're teaching the history of human rights, so you must get into the standards. I mean, the whole idea is accountability. I mean, that's what makes human rights a bit different than just norms about social justice. I mean, we can talk about social justice, and we should and we do, but the human rights piece of it means it's not enough just to talk about justice. It means that there's accountability. It means that somebody has to fix this problem. And that somebody is the state who signed international standards. There's responsibilities. In UN language, there's duty bearers and there's rights holders. And the duty bearers are those who have signed international treaties, made them law and are harmonizing national laws, and are obliged, not only morally, but legally, to abide by them. And the accountability, that's why there's Human Rights Watch. And human rights education is partly also about public citizen accountability towards their governments or other governments around these norms. The accountability piece is really important, and that's why I actually don't think human rights education is going to disappear, because we're going to these standards aren't going to go away. Because I worried about it 5 years ago. There got to be much more of a buzz around human rights education, and I got worried because I thought, well, my gosh, what's going to happen? Is it going to be, I mean, I myself was more of a kind of a peace and democracy education person like around 20 years ago, 25 years ago, and peace education has a role now once we see it, but it's embedded, it's nice, it's often very soft, it opens up, I think, ways of looking at structural violence and it's very nice, but I don't see the teeth in it. It's got a role, but I don't see teeth, and so I got worried that human rights education might get a little bit diluted, that it might because there were I saw in schools that people were beginning to teach it, but they were just teaching about the norms. Not to diminish them, but they were just teaching about equality issues, justice issues, and the piece about human rights that makes it kind of different is that we have to do something about it. It's the action component, it's the accountability, and because those standards aren't going away, I'm optimistic that human rights education will remain. But how we do it in schools and how well we do it then is the question. I guess the last thing I want to reflect on in terms of its importance is to recognize actually that the access points for human rights education are going to be very different depending on your learner groups, your schools, or in our case, the countries we live in. Having looked at HREA across different countries, it really does show up differently, or at least it starts differently in schools. In some places, for example, schools or teachers get interested in human rights education because there's a problem of bullying, or there's a problem of integrating children of minority families in the school, or violence, asocial behavior. Okay, those could be access points. So that there's a problem that needs to be addressed, and human rights as a normative system comes in to address them with the rights. Okay, but you can't stop there. I mean, that's the thing. It's a message I guess I'd like to sort of really enforce to you, that if you have an access point, whether it's bullying or whether it's tensions between minority communities and majority communities in your hometown, or if you're living in a post-apartheid society, whatever political or personal context you have for starting human rights education, use it, but broaden, go further, because human rights education is it's bigger than those problems. It gives us an opportunity to really look broadly at rights, and I think that's what we have to try to do. But I did want to recognize that how the access points will be different, and how and why human rights education is showing up in Poland, and how and why it's showing up in South Africa, or in Northern Ireland, or in Los Angeles are going to vary, and that's fine. We take those points, but we push them further. So, what are the results of HRE? because we want to see those, right? And then I'm going to move into approaches really quickly. We haven't had a lot of research, and that's been a real problem. But we're getting more. And we can get more because we're finding that educational systems are beginning to invest more in them, which makes sense. So one of the places where there's a lot of exciting things happening now in human rights education, I mean, there's lots of places where it's really exciting, but most recently I've been very excited about what's happening in Ireland and in Northern Ireland. For whatever reasons, there's funding that's flown, that's come in. Amnesty International in Ireland has a fabulous relationship with the educational administrators in high levels and at district levels. In the UK, in Hampshire County Council, I don't know if anyone has heard, you probably haven't, they did a whole essentially district-wide HRE effort, and they linked it up with school development. So there were like, good grief, there were hundreds of schools, I think, that participated in a whole school approach to human rights education over many years. It's called Rights, Respect, and Responsibility, because, often you have the rights and responsibility linked up, and they did rights, respect, and responsibility. And they did a 3-year assessment of what they've been doing in particular in 16 schools. So I'm just going to give you some of these results. I know I'm speaking quickly. Are you keeping up with me so far? Okay, I'm sorry, but there's so much. You should see what I'm not saying. So I'm just going to read directly from this because it's an executive summary, and I don't want to paraphrase. But I really want to read this because it's really important. Because unless we can show that human rights education actually improves what we want to do, which is not only creating a better environment for students and teachers, but actually improving achievement, it's going to be very limited what we can do. And this is the first study and only study I have found so far that shows these links. Okay. They compared two cohorts of schools that had partially implemented rights, respect, and responsibility, and schools that had completely implemented them. So even the points of comparisons are not schools that didn't do anything, but schools that did something, and then schools that did everything they had wanted them to do in a whole school approach. Comparing schools in which RRR was fully incorporated with those in which it was less fully incorporated, the following outcomes were found. Among pupils of all age groups were improvements in social relationships, behavior, and achievement. Pupils were reported to be more respectful and helpful to others and less aggressive and disruptive. Pupils also were observed to show greater respect for the school environment. They were more careful with books, desks, and school equipment. Pupils participated more in the classroom and in extracurricular activities such as clubs and school councils. Pupils' academic engagement and achievement were enhanced. This was reflected in improved critical thinking skills, confidence in tackling new tasks, and increased SAT scores. Overall, pupils were reported to have increased in their self-regulatory capacity. This seems to be the key thing. They were more self-regulating. Accepting the responsibilities they've learned are the concomitants of their rights. Teachers reported an overall positive effect of RRR on their teaching and relationships within the school. The teachers in the fully implemented schools reported fewer feelings of exhaustion as a direct result of their work, felt more energized when dealing with students, experienced less frustration with teaching, and reported an increase in a sense of personal achievement. Implementation was most sustained and progressive where head teachers were fully supportive of RRR, meaning support from the headmasters, principals. When head teachers were strategic in its implementation and were able to use RRR in an overarching, integrative framework into which all other initiatives were fit. This is very important. In other words, it wasn't just looking at curriculum in the classroom. Rights, responsibility, and respect in this case were seen as an overarching framework for all the work of the school. And that's where you see the greatest benefits here, which makes sense. Not as easy to organize, but it makes sense. Here's the challenges, because I want to be balanced about this. Some head teachers reported a number of challenges to implementation, including pressures to improve pupil achievement, reluctance from individual teachers to adopt the RRR, and initiative overload. However, the data from those schools in which RRR has become fully embedded indicate that, over time, the implementation of the RRR becomes self-perpetuating through its positive outcomes on pupils and teachers. And this finding, this is really important, and it actually reflects another finding we had from Germany, where they had like 49 UNESCO schools that decided to implement HRE as a commemorative event related to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it was imposed. A little bit different than this, our framework in Hampshire County Council in the UK. But the self-perpetuating part was really important because this doctoral student did his dissertation on these schools and found that among those teachers that had been somewhat reluctant to teach, in this case, children's rights specifically, once they began to teach it and they found that the students responded well to it, became extremely convinced by its value. So teachers who have been given the opportunity, or in this case even required to teach it, who presumably did it somewhat, I mean I can't give you details on the German implementation, became convinced that they should do it more, and they've continued it because students respond really well. That's very exciting. So here's some early research, and if you think about it, it kind of makes sense when you think about the holistic approach that you could have potentially all these benefits. And it was a really important study to also show that full implementation is important too, not partial, which makes our standards higher, makes our job harder. But I think we should keep our mind on that. We should keep our sights on those. So let me jump now. I'm sorry, I'm going to skip over definition of HRE. I have in your handout, in your folder, I pulled together some definitions of human rights education. They're the formal ones that were developed by the Office of the UN Commissioner for Human Rights. That's generally for HRE. It's not just for schools, it's for everyone. And it's lifelong learning, it's human rights education for all. It's the focus on advocacy, it's the et cetera, et cetera. And then there's some other definitions that are there. You're looking at them anyway. I'm not going to read them. You can read them on your own. But to give you the other, some elaborations that have been made by, say, Amnesty and others in regards to knowledge, skills, and attitudes, empowerment, and links with citizenship education. Again, the pieces that HRE brings that you can't find in citizenship education, but they go nicely together. And I talk about citizenship, I mean democratic citizenship education, are social justice, social responsibility, and taking action. I mean, they're pieces that only HRE brings, including accountability. So we can get into that discussion later. It's kind of theoretical and go back and forth. But I mentioned it a bit, and Pam encouraged me to as well, because all of us believe we're doing human rights education in some way, and the question is, if we are we touching just a part of it? Can we go further? I mean, where does it start? Where does it stop? And the handout also that I have, that you have, I believe it's on page 2 and 3, some proposed learner goals. Again, I'm not going to go into these, but more for you if it's useful for you to see that this is just something that was pulled together for learner goals to show there's some ages that are put in there, it's development, you almost ignore the ages if you want to. It kind of depends where you're starting with your target group. I mean, I could use these with adults, but you can see there's core concepts and values, core skills, issues and problems, human rights related standards and instruments. This is not a prescriptive learning framework at all, but it's an example of how you could see HRE being integrated, how there might be developmental, age-appropriate HRE done in schools. And you can see, if you look at this closely another time, that it can be connected up with probably what you're already doing. It can be connected up with citizenship education or history education, social studies, even humanities education. But the human rights, but there are also some of these elements, and we can go through them with a fine-tooth comb, that are specifically human rights related. And typically HRE, unless you're doing history of human rights or the international standards, is integrated with many other social emotional learning outcomes and content areas related to what we call civics education or citizenship education. But I wanted to give you this example because it's quite concrete, and sometimes teachers find that useful. But again, it's not prescriptive. I know most of you are already teaching and you have your own approach. Okay, but I know that I'm supposed to conclude now, but I think this is important. I want to conclude by going back, if you want to go back to your handout on page 2, I guess it goes to the bottom of page 1. HRE Supports in Schools. This is getting back to the idea of a systemic approach to human rights education, which is really what I want to conclude my conversation with you on, partly because of the diversity of this group too. Curriculum is important, but there's many dimensions of HRE supports that schools ideally would have. I mentioned the World Program for Human Rights Education that the UN has passed and which is promoting. They've identified 5 areas of supports, and these are the ones that I've listed here, and I'm just going to elaborate a little bit on what they are. And if you have any interest in examples of any of these, I'm happy to talk to you about those, but that's what I'm going to leave for question and answer, because I have really nice examples of pre-service teacher training models that are being done in other places. I mean, so whatever you want to talk about. But let's just go through this list, and then I'll and then we'll open up for conversation. The 5 areas that they've identified for these guidelines for the WILT program are, on the one hand, policies, laws, and guidelines related to human rights education. And examples of these are anti-discrimination laws that you could have that would be national, or I guess in the U.S. is so big it could be statewide, curricular standards, policies on inclusion. They might not be called even human rights education. In some cases, curriculums are called human rights education, like in California, where it's human rights and Holocaust education standards. And you can find those, but you can also find related laws and guidelines which have human rights principles or could be human rights related. But there are policies, laws, and guidelines which, again, provide a framework. Sometimes it's required. I mean, sometimes there's even accountability around these laws. But this is one area where you can find human rights education presented. And I have here a note, at least in mine, I guess not yours. There are curricular frameworks I mentioned in the UK. They have global and local citizenship curricular standards, and human rights is embedded within those. And as I mentioned, in the U.S. also we have them in our curricular frameworks. Of course, the question is how much do these laws or frameworks nudge? How much do they require, right? Lots of times it's you all who are inspired around human rights that take the opportunity to teach it because you're not precluded from doing that. But that's not the same as what they had in Germany where everybody had to. That's a different issue. And a different problem, by the way, as well, in terms of standards. Second area, the learning environments of the school and classroom. Again, the point here being we're not just talking about what happens inside the classroom, we're talking about hidden curriculum, we're talking about whole school approaches for promoting infusion of human rights norms in school policies, operations and relationships, democratic classroom environments, discipline policies, real opportunities for students to participate, how people get along with each other in the school. You could imagine, if you look at the school as a community, that human rights wouldn't just be about knowledge. It would be about relationships and policies and, it's the real life of the school. Not easy, right? But part of what the RRR study showed is when those are addressed well, as part of school development, and you can imagine, you have much greater impact in terms of, in this case, student behavior and achievement, if that's what we're focusing on. And, of course, we're looking at other things as well. In learning tools is the third area. Moving on from learning environments, this is what we're all very familiar with, of course. These are study guides, videos, website-based research. These are the kinds of things we do with our students. The fourth area, evaluation and assessment methods. This is always a little bit tricky. If you're teaching human rights already, you have a way that you assess your students, but oftentimes, teachers say, well, I'm really interested in if my students care about the world. I'm really interested to know if they're motivated to be involved in doing something outside of the school. Those aren't things that you necessarily get grades for, right? But those things you care about. So we've got to, in terms of assessment, sort out what can be assessed in the school formally that the school would require you as teachers or as you as administrators would want you want your teachers to be held accountable for, but also recognize that there might be some other valuable things coming out of HRE which wouldn't be captured in the same way. Or you might decide to capture it, but it might be a little bit non-traditional. But there's other ways in which evaluation and assessment tools can be used also to promote HRE, teacher action research on the school environment, evaluation of content of textbooks for human rights knowledge, for human rights norms. There's been gender-based reviews of textbooks in other countries, for example. Very interesting. We did one in Morocco to sort of see to what degree there's sort of a gender discrimination and sexism represented in textbooks through a whole variety of criteria. So you can use, again, evaluation and research to make a case to understand your environment better and to plan to change. Finally, professional development, not at all the least, much harder to get HRE and pre-service education. That goes without saying. So I'm so thrilled, really thrilled that there are teacher training colleges represented here. In-service is a little bit easier, but pre-service is tough. We have some good examples. Again, if you want to talk about them, we have some great examples now from some other countries. And I guess the last point about that is in most of these good examples, it's not just the school systems. It's absolutely a key partner being teachers and administrators and school systems as a whole, but often it's other organizations working with them. So this fabulous pre-service training program that's getting launched in Ireland, for example, it's Amnesty working with the Human Rights Center that has been established at a teacher training college, St. Patrick's. So it's still, you see, as we often do in human rights education, as we have now in this room represented, collaborations between teachers, between educational institutions, between nonprofit organizations with shared agendas. And so I'm very excited to see how our day evolves and the kind of plans that get developed here, but wanted to reinforce that this kind of collaboration is what's working very well in other places as well. Thanks for your time.
Sorry. We have about 10 minutes for either several really short questions or one long one, but I would ask if we could just squeeze in as many questions as possible for the next 10 minutes. And Felicia, I'm just going to have you call on the folks.
What I've observed actually in the United States is that there are more and more human rights centers popping up in universities, a lot. And so I think that a wise strategy is to have a kind of institution, often it's a human rights center, but like I know other universities have something called like committees on human rights studies that link up faculty on campus who are already teaching something related to human rights and lift it up so the students can recognize it. So even if you don't have a minor, for example, in human rights, you at least have self-recognized classes that together could comprise a kind of human rights.
Nationally, I was wondering if like we're doing that, but I'm thinking.
Okay, there's a network there's IHREA, International Human Rights Educators Network, and we can also pass that around. There are numerous networks now for higher education faculty to link up with each other. The IHREN is based out of Utica, I think, and Ted Orland directs it, and he has been personally in the last few years going around the world and encouraging faculty to link up with each other and organizing regional conferences. There's also a resource that I think that Human Rights Watch pulled together that was compiled by Rita Moran, who's based up in Berkeley, and it's a compilation of syllabi that have been used to teach human rights on campuses. So, but networking is probably the best way to go. And more, for those of you who are faculty members who do go to conferences and present, increasingly there are these subcommittees coming with human rights related. So networking is probably the way to go. But institutionally, I have to say that there are more and more human rights centers, and they're cross-disciplinary, because like 15 years ago, usually it was just law schools. And now there's much more happening at the university that's cross-disciplinary, which is really promising. But again, this could be, if there's general interest in this Human Rights Educators Network for higher education, perhaps it can be circulated, but otherwise, I'm happy to send it to you. Just let me know. Yes?
To address what you feel is either the perceived or real perception that there might be some tension, intellectually or practically, between human rights education and multiculturalism? The idea of this global set of universal...
I understand.
...versus this right to
well, I see those as two different challenges. One is this sort of perpetual question of how universal values can be contextualized so that it's not relative. So you don't, sort of cherry pick the human rights you like and leave the rest behind. And that's, of course, a perennial question for human rights. The position of the UN and the position that you have to take as human rights educators is that they're indivisible in the universal period. In reality, there's going to be some human rights that are going to be prioritized more, and you can never use the argument of relativism to ignore, human rights. I mean, so that question is perennial, and there's so many books written on that. So I want to avoid that, only to say that stand firm on that one, but recognizing that in reality there's going to be attention focused on certain human rights, and you have to be strategic when you're advocating. Human Rights Watch knows all about this. You focus on certain rights, you get some leverage, you can move in, and then you bring the other ones in. I mean, I do a lot of work in children's rights because people think, oh, children's rights, that's so nice. They don't realize, I mean, I was working in China, what was I looking at? Children's rights. But if you get children's rights in, then you put in the UDHR, and then you get women's rights, and then you move forward. So it's so strategic, But the question of multiculturalism, I see that more as a mood issue. Now, in Europe, they call it intercultural education, and increasingly, what now is happening, and I think it's, what's his name? He's very famous. Oh, gosh, I should know his name. He was like one of these big guys in multicultural, was it Banks?
James Banks.
James Banks, he's become a real believer in human rights education. And now he is and he's, just like Betty Reardon, who was the peace education person, you will now see that human rights education and inclusiveness is the term being used, are hand in hand. Because human rights education is about what? Partly respect for minorities, right? It's from a rights-based perspective, but the agenda being living together, inclusiveness, minority rights. So I don't see those debates as, I don't actually see them anymore. In fact, let me see if I can find this example. For example, in the UK, which I don't think is too far afield in terms of some of the issues. Let me just see if I don't know if I find it now, but I'll tell you that there's the curricular framework that they have for local and global citizenship has different thematic areas. Actually, I want to read these to you because I think it's really nice. Let me see if I click here. Here it is. The key concepts, here they are. There's 4 of them. And this is under local and global citizenship. The first is diversity and inclusion. You don't have it, but we can send this around as well, so if you're interested. Second, human rights and social responsibility. Third, equality and social justice. Fourth, democracy and active participation. That's how they did it. Again, human rights within the citizenship framework. So really, more and more, and James Banks has been working a lot with, well, anyway, I won't go into details, but I'm flabbergasted. Just the last 2-3 years, you're seeing it coming together here in the States, this human rights and not but interculturalism and inclusiveness and diversity. This is a big issue for Europe because of all the migration, with the EU. So they've really had to struggle with this. So some of it's coming over here now. But if this is interesting for you as an example of a framework, so I understand the question. I know in the past it's been a tension, but I see it less and less. Are you going to give that to me? Yes. If you could remind me, this is the UK. Learning for Life and Work, Local and Global Citizenship Standards. It's 2 pages. And underneath these, by the way, are all kinds of learner outcomes. Very nice. Very nice. Okay.
Is that on the HREA's website?
Pardon?
Is that on the HREA's website?
No, it's not. And what's happening now is that my organization is working with 4 international organizations compiling a compendium of best practices for human rights education for the OSCE, which is Europe basically and North America. And I received 200 entries from countries. And I'm seeing all kinds of stuff I hadn't seen, like this, which is great. So I happen to have a lot at my fingertips. We haven't put it on the website because we're actually going to publish it in the compendium. Pam, I know, or Human Rights Watch will let you all know, but the compendium for good practices in human rights education, which is going to be chock full not of annotated bibliographies, but actual resources, will be launched along with the 60th anniversary of the UDHR this December. And it's going to be online, and it's going to be hard copy, and it's really cool. I mean, there are things I didn't know was happening in Azerbaijan. But the UK has a lot happening. So she can probably share it now, but it's not on the website because we're probably going to put it in the compendium. I tired you out already?
Time for one more question.
No?
Surely there has to be one more question.
I'm curious. Len asked me, and Len has written a bit about the connection of human rights education with media literacy and the importance of teaching students to be critical of media and also to be able to create media. What's your...
Great. Absolutely, because we're talking about public domain. I mean, I think especially in countries where human rights is either politicized or it's underrepresented or it's superficially understood. I guess that's most countries. Media literacy is absolutely critical. I think having an exercise for kids have to use the newspaper and print resources and do critical analysis, or we have alternative. It's a great way to link up HRE with contemporary issues. If you teach that, I'm sure it's very successful. Yeah. Yep.
I'm at a disadvantage because I've never taught human rights, and I think most people here have. But my question is, if I were designing a curriculum, I would not know whether to start with the history of human rights or current applications, or law on human rights, or local versus international, or the application of human rights to all fields, or what would be valuable in an introductory course. Is there a place I could research that?
I don't know anyone who's written about it. I think there's just people who have experiences. I mean, which approaches. The discussions I've heard are more, how do we take the opportunity of a cross-curricular approach and have something real happen in classrooms? So what would other people say? What would your advice be to David on that question? Yeah.
I'd start with your gut feeling. The kids from there, because I think the kids will take it, and they'll take it to a level that you may not have experienced before, and that's what's happened with the program that I work with in LA.
Someone else, yeah?
Could I ask Ann to address that?
You were talking earlier about the need to understand your local community, and so that's really what you're going for. So to some extent, it depends. I mean, if you're looking at a school system that places the curricular standards so much at the forefront that you are prescribed each day when you teach, then the question becomes thinking first about pedagogy and then thinking about how you were teaching this, and then how you present information valuable within the context of what you must do already, which is very much the school system in which I work. There's a prescription, the state standards in California for history teacher, unfortunately, I'm very happy upon, are so prescriptive, it's very difficult for my history colleagues to figure out how to talk about it without having some kind of conflict attached to it. So I think you need to examine what you must do and then think about what you can do, because I think that the must-dos can come from outside, but they also come internally as well.
Does it help, David?
Does it help you?
It's a... Thank you, Ann.
It's the blind man and the elephant to some extent. It's whatever you want it to be. And, I'd like to hear more and maybe the workshop.
Okay, good. Do we have time for another question?
Wait, let's squeeze one more in.
Okay.
Judith?
It's a great question, David.
I had a question. At the school I work with, in one of the courses that we had on human rights, one of the conflicts was I have a lot of Latin American students, and specifically I have a huge population of Colombian immigrant students. And one of the questions was, in discussing these human rights, is the confusion with, for example, in the state of Colombia, state-sponsored terror, and that state co-opting human rights movement, and the confusion that creates within society of how you justify abuses or violence and non-justice. And so when I try to translate to how can I answer to that in the classroom, to say what's right, what's not right, and how do we promote human rights education, I was really just kind of stuck. And trying to search for also information or resources that would allow me to expand more on giving them answers to that is, because I'm confused myself, how does a country do that and the society gets confused, and then I'm dealing with those students in my classroom to justify the war that they were escaping there with their families. So.
I have two suggestions, and of course, those of you who are working in the classroom, maybe you can chime in here. The first is that when you're working with students from a country, when it's their own country, and there's a lot of feelings around, it might be helpful to look at other case studies as well. So. State-sponsored violence against citizens is happening in many places, not just Colombia. So, you might be able to step back and help your students examine, to me it's quite clear what's right and what's wrong here. But if the issue here is that your students are feeling very emotional about Colombia, or they're feeling compromised because it's, maybe I don't know what all the impediments are for their discussing this openly, but you could be looking at other countries where there has been state-sponsored violence and it's been resolved. I mean, even in Latin America, the idea would be to look at other Latin American examples. I would say look at Colombia, but if you could look at other examples where there have been, they've moved out of state-sponsored terrorism, and they've moved through human rights commissions, and now they're in established democracy. So take other examples from Latin America, and they're very nice ones. But second thing, it just so happens in Colombia, there's some really nice things happening in human rights education, believe it or not. And I can talk to you about this on the side, but there are attempts, and it's very delicate, and human rights is extremely loaded, and that's not just for Colombia. There's many places where like Sri Lanka, where there's lots of state-sponsored violence, where even like the UN can't use the words human rights. They do it, but they don't call it that because it's so stigmatized. So we can talk about that on the side, but yeah. Thank you all for your attention.